Greetings, urban farmers, gardeners, and healthy food visionaries. Farmer Greg here, and welcome to the 602nd episode of the Urban Farm Podcast, where every day we work together to educate and inspire you to become part of your food revolution. Water is one of the things we need multiple times a day. And as it gets hotter and drier, we need to become a lot more aware of where our water comes from and where it goes. Plus, when we're growing food, we're going to need to think about where we're getting our water from. People are surprised when they learn that I collect rainwater for my garden, even though I live in the desert of Phoenix, Arizona. What most people don't know is that you can harvest a lot of water. For example, it only takes 1 inch of rain on a 1,000 square foot collection area, such as the roof of your house, to collect 600 gallons of water. That's why you don't need to live in a wet place for water harvesting to be a viable self-sufficiency tool for your house and garden. If I can do it in Phoenix, then you can do it no matter where you are, especially if you live in a wetter place than where I do. Learning to harvest your own fresh water means you don't have to rely heavily on your area's municipal water supply. You can be in control of the inputs into your garden and stop watering your plants with chemically treated water. If you're ready to up-level your garden game and explore all the possibilities of harvesting water, you'll want to attend the Urban Farm U's upcoming online water harvesting summit this June 15th through the 17th. This 3-day event features visionary speakers sharing their expert knowledge on topics like rainwater harvesting, graywater harvesting, subsurface irrigation, building healthy soil to hold more water, and more. The 2021 Water Harvesting Summit is free to attend, and you're going to learn the best techniques for watering your garden and saving water. And I have a little surprise in store for you when you sign up. To reserve your spot in the summit, head over to waterharvestingsummit.com and get ready to create the self-sufficient life of your dreams. Welcome, everybody. I'm excited. This is our second monthly garden chat with an amazing expert. Tonight, we have Jessica Walliser. Jessica co-hosted The Organic Gardeners, an award-winning program on KDKA radio in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania for 15 years. That's absolutely amazing. She is a former contributing editor for Organic Gardening magazine, as well as being a co-founder of the popular gardening website, savvygardening.com. Write that down. You want to go check that out. savvygardening.com. I actually just got today is it a monthly newsletter?
Twice monthly.
Twice a month. I got their newsletter today and they were talking about raised beds. Great information there. Jessica is also the author of 7, not 6, but 7 gardening books, including the Amazon bestseller, Good Bug, Bad Bug, Who's Who and What They Do, and her newest book, Plant Partners, Science-Based Companion Planting Strategies for the Vegetable Garden. She's also been on our podcast multiple times, most recently, episode 588, talking about her book, Plant Partners, Science-Based Companion Planting Strategies. So look for that. That was episode 588. Welcome, Jessica. Thank you for being here.
Well, thank you for inviting me, Greg. It's always fun to join you.
Absolutely. So just tell me a little bit about your Savvy Gardening website. Let's go there first.
Sure, we'll start there. So Savvy Gardening is a website that I run with 2 partners, and my 2 partners are Tara Nolan. She's from Toronto, Canada, and Nikki Jabor, who's way up north in Nova Scotia, Halifax, Nova Scotia. And then I, as I mentioned earlier, I'm from Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. So we've got 3 different gardening and growing zones represented here and 2 different countries, which is pretty cool. And we sort of write about everything connected to gardening, from growing edible plants and herbs and fruits and, vegetables, obviously, to ornamental plants, shrubs and trees, to insects in the garden and how to manage them and how to encourage the good ones. And we have DIY projects and gardening techniques and composting and soil and all types of things. So we started the website in 2014. And we just, started it as a fun little side project to work on together. And then 2016, we really started to sort of see the potential, the ability for us to really reach a whole lot of gardeners through that platform and really provide some good quality information. So we took it
Nice.
legit, so to speak, in
Yeah.
2016, and we've been riding it ever since. We get about 1.5 million visitors a month, which is pretty cool.
What?
Yep, from all over the world. In fact,
Wow.
it was really cool. If you go into Google Analytics for your website, you can actually see the location where people log into your website from.
Right.
And we had every single country except Cuba and in a country that I can't remember in Western Africa, the Democratic Republic of the Congo. So those are the
Wow.
only 2 countries in the whole world where we didn't have any users from in that month. So
Oh, wow. That's
it's
amazing.
pretty cool. Yeah, it's pretty cool. And we love it, of course. It's become quite a passion for us. 2 of us are horticulturists. The other is a professional editor. So we have a whole lot of fun together there.
Wow. Congratulations. That's amazing.
Thanks.
Now,
Yeah, thank you.
I did recently have Nikki on the podcast, and I learned something very interesting. There is a time zone east of Eastern Standard Time.
There is.
I didn't know that.
There is Atlantic time zone. Yep. And that's where
Yeah.
she is. That's where Nova Scotia is. Yeah. So she's 1 hour ahead of us here on the East Coast. So whenever we have our little Skype working calls for Savvy Gardening, we always have Jessica and Tara time because we're both in Eastern. And then we always have Nikki time because she's an hour ahead of us.
Wow,
so,
there
yeah.
you go.
Yep,
Well, that just blew me away. It was just so different because we're on Pacific time, so that makes her 4 hours different, not 3. So,
yeah.
anyways. So we're going to talk about, thank you for that, by the way. We're going to talk about partnering with nature tonight. And, I study permaculture, and permaculture, that's really a big part of what permaculture is about, is how do we work in conjunction with nature rather than against nature. So I'll bring that perspective, but I really want you to bring your perspective. And let's start with, why is it important to partner with nature?
I think for the most part, it makes our lives easier as gardeners.
Right.
We're not constantly having to fight things and feeling like we're in this battle mentality. Instead, it's really a much more collaborative mentality in the garden, which in the long run, obviously makes maintaining the garden a whole lot easier.
Mm-hmm.
So rather than everything being contrary, instead we're sort of going with the flow. That's important, to make our life simpler, but it's also really important simply because it's our responsibility, right? We are more connected to the earth than probably anybody except a farmer, right?
Right.
So we have this very intimate and intricate connection with the earth that, people who don't spend much time outside don't have.
Mm-hmm.
And so I think we have a great responsibility to be good stewards of the land and to be responsible gardeners who are thoughtful in the care that we offer to our plants, because we also know how much that care can affect all of the other organisms living in our landscape, whether it's, from the littlest soil microbes up to, the mammals that live in our landscape as well, and then certainly the humans also. So I think that it's essential, really, that we work with nature and that we understand the impact that we can possibly have, both
Mm-hmm.
negative impact and positive impact on the natural processes that happen out in our gardens. It's just smart. It's a responsible thing to do.
Well, one of the things that I do here at the Urban Farm is I let things go to seed, and I just let them reseed themselves. And so I have a forest garden in my front yard, and at any given moment, there's 10 or 15 things growing there that I didn't plant this year. They just plant themselves year over years. So that's one way to partner with nature. What are some of the other ways that we can partner with nature?
Yeah, and that can be a responsible way to partner with nature. It can also be an irresponsible way to partner with nature,
Ooh,
depending on what's reseeding. So if you have something there that's a non-native, that doesn't belong in that environment, that
Mm-hmm.
really is an exotic plant that can really displace our native species, depending on where you live, that can be a downside to it. So it's knowing what plants you're growing, which ones you're allowing to grow from seed. And it's fine if you're talking about, an oak or, a native perennial like a coneflower or something like that. That reseeding, that's native to your gardening zone, that's fantastic. And that is a great way to be a good steward in the garden. But if it's something that's exotic, maybe not. So, yeah,
exactly.
Yeah.
Well,
so lots of other ways. True. And I'm sorry, I was circling back to your original question.
No, that's okay. But exotic and invasive is even more problematic.
Definitely more problematic.
Be careful.
Yeah.
Be careful planting out invasive species. So.
Yep. And that might not even be spreading from seed. That could also be spreading by rhizome or by, really aggressive root system, or it could layer just sort of where the branch touches the soil. It forms, new root structure, and they can spread that way as well, depending on the plant. So know your plants, get to know them, get to know where they're from. Yeah. So you asked about what some other ways are that we can really partner with nature. I would say probably one that most of your listeners are familiar with, that's sort of a no-brainer for many gardeners, is composting, where you're not sending things to the landfill. Instead, you are repurposing them. You're keeping that closed loop intact and in place in your garden, where everything, all of the waste that's produced from your landscape is turned into treasure, so to speak, right? Composted, breaking down, and then you're returning it back to the garden to feed your plants. You can compost in a bin, a barrel, whatever. You can actually just compost in place by letting the leaves fall off the tree, leaving your perennial stems in the beds, not pulling out your annuals and just leaving them sort of decomposing in place on the soil surface, which is the way Mother Nature intended it to be. So there's nothing wrong with doing that. If you have a big perennial bed and you don't like the way those, sticks look standing, year after year, you could mow them down and just leave the mowing drop to the ground, and they'll break down really fast and go on to feed those plants. So that's sort of composting without having a composting bin.
Yeah. Well, and that's a really good way to partner with nature, is just by letting the stuff be like it is in the forest. Nobody goes and rakes a forest, right?
Right. And a forest is that regeneration. I mean, it's a regenerative cycle. The plants feed themselves. They take from the soil what they need, but eventually they'll return it in the form of their dropped leaves, or animals will eat their leaves, leave their waste behind. And so you have that cycle. And so we gardeners, instead, what we do is we rake up all the leaves and we cut everything down, and we feel like we have to put the garden to bed tidy at the end of every season, when really that's not how nature intended it to be. And that's how we shouldn't garden either. We need to be, I think, a little more messy. And I always say we need to stop treating our gardens like our living rooms.
Oh, right. Say a little more about that.
I did an interesting post on Savvy Gardening a number of years ago where I talked about how to do the right kind of fall cleanup that wasn't destructive, in particular to pollinators that are overwintering, beneficial insects like ladybugs and lacewings. They need a place to spend the winter in our garden. And when we cut everything down, rake everything up, we're taking away overwintering sites. So, one of the opening lines that I said in there is, we need to stop treating our gardens like our living rooms, where we're vacuuming up every last fallen leaf and everything has to be clean and pristine, because that's not how nature works. We need to leave dead plant stems for our native pollinators to take shelter in and lay eggs in during the growing season. We need to leave, leaf litter lie on the ground, because that's where so many of our butterflies will overwinter actually as adults, or caterpillars, or pupa. So we should be leaving all of that alone in our landscapes as much as possible. That doesn't necessarily mean you need to let big wads of leaves on your lawn, because we know that's not good for the lawn. But in all of your perennial beds, certainly in any area you have that's wooded on your property, leave those leaves lie, let them break down in place. Let the pollinators have a place to, stay for the winter and to lay their eggs. It's better, more responsible gardening.
Yeah. One of the things that I do is, in the leaves on the lawn, they go into the mower. They get shredded up, and then all of that goes into the chicken coop, and the chickens do what the chickens do, and then all of that goes in the compost bin.
Right. There you go. Right. So again, you're getting that closed loop and that cycle of using everything that comes out of your garden and providing it with another purpose.
Yeah. Now, you talk a lot about bugs in a lot of what you do. You've written a couple of books on bugs, good bug, bad bug. And, I get probably once a month, I'll get an email from somebody and they'll show me a picture of a bug. And it's like, oh my God, how do I kill it? Their first thought is, how do I kill it? And I get the same question about mushrooms. How do I kill it? And these are beneficials in a lot of cases. And so speak to that, would you?
Yeah, well, I think that is important to really tell people how very few insect species are actually pests. So there's about 1 million or so identified insect species on this planet.
Wow, didn't know that.
That's how many we've identified. But scientists think there's actually between 2 and 20 million. So at the very best end of that, we've only identified half. if there are 20 million, then obviously
Wow.
there are species going extinct far faster than we can identify them and name them by science,
Yeah.
right? So of the 1 million that we know about, that we have identified, less than 1% of those are classified as known human or agricultural pests.
Wow.
So less than 1% of that 1 million are actually proven to be pests. So when you come across an insect in your garden or in your yard or even in your home, the chances that it's going to be harmful to you or your plants or your pet or your kids are actually really, really small. There's a far better chance that that insect is providing a really valuable ecosystem service, that it is either, benign or beneficial in some way. Maybe it's a pollinator, maybe it's a decomposer, maybe it's food for someone higher up on the food chain. It's got a role to play. So to automatically assume that it's bad is like saying that every person that you see on the street is a wicked and awful person. And there, of course, are their share of wicked and awful people out there, but the vast majority are good. And so same thing can be said of the insects in our garden. So proper identification is absolutely key. Before you take action against anything you find in your garden, from the insect world, it is so, so important that you properly identify it.
Well, and that's just not for bugs. I had a guy recently emailing me, something was eating his broccoli. And he kept showing me pictures. He's like, all right. And his question was, well, how do I kill it? Well, first of all, we have to figure out what it is. And it got to the point where he put in a small game camera, and it was rats. It was pack rats that were jumping in. So you have to be able to identify what you're dealing with before you take action, right?
You do, yeah. And that's the thing. A lot of times, if we're not seeing the creature that is quote unquote harming our plants, we're making assumptions about it without really doing the detective work that's required first. So one of the most clever tricks that I learned a long time ago from, oh my gosh, I think it was maybe my radio partner, my original radio partner years and years ago, I think was the one that told me this. I said, well, how do you know if it's a groundhog, if it's a gopher, if it's a chipmunk, if it's a rat, if it's a mouse, if it's a vole or a mole or what squirrel? How do you know what it is that's eating your plants? And he had this really good trick. He said, well, you go out into your garden in the evening, because usually these creatures a lot of times will feed at night.
Yep.
And you put baking flour all around the plants that are getting attacked on the soil.
Of course.
A thick layer of baking flour. And then in the morning, you go out and you see whose footprints are in the flour.
Right.
And
that's brilliant.
Isn't it? It's pure genius. I was like, oh my. Okay, so you do have to do a little Googling if you come up with a track, a track that you're like, is that a possum or a raccoon or what is that, right? So you still have to do a little sleuthing, but at least it will be it'll tell you, is it a deer or is it a groundhog or is it a squirrel, right? So their footprints all look really different. But I thought that was really quite a genius way to discover who's
oh my gosh. I am so excited about that. That is a perfect solution. Can I use it?
Sure.
All right.
Yeah, absolutely. Let me know how it works out. And also too, sort of like where the damage is occurring. Right. So like we know deer will eat from the top down or the sides in. Right. Whereas a lot of times bunnies will eat from the bottom up. So if, your lilies are eaten off and they're eating, the bottom leaves are gone, but the top leaves are intact, it's probably a bunny. If it's the whole darn thing missing, it might be a groundhog. So, which I don't know if you guys have groundhogs out there in Arizona.
No, we don't. We have rats and moles. Those are the two.
Moles would not be eating plants ever. Moles are insectivores.
Ah.
All a mole will eat are insects. So they will eat grubs and earthworms and
I guess
ground
it's
beetles.
gophers that we have here.
Could be gophers, or it could be voles with a V. And voles with a V look like little mice, but with a stubby tail. And they live in big colonies. And they are the ones that will eat your bulbs. They'll eat your rhizomes. They'll eat your tubers. Yeah, those guys are really good garden companions.
In the realm of partnering with nature, what do we do about moles and voles and gophers and...
Yeah, well, so I guess it depends on what they're attacking and also, let's say, how passionate you are about what they're damaging. So like for me, where we see most mole with an M damage here is in the lawn, where they're tunneling underneath the turf to get to the grubs and the earthworms, and they cause sort of like raised bumps in the lawn and ridges and like holes and little mounds of soil behind, that doesn't bother me. Actually, I don't mind them at all in that instance. And so I don't do anything about them, because it's just my lawn. I don't really care that much about my lawn. I'll just go out and step down the paths and kick the little mounds aside. But if it's voles and they're in my garden and they're eating my potatoes out from underneath my plants, or they're damaging my radish, which they do quite a bit here, then in the case of voles, I actually will set little mouse traps in the garden baited with peanut butter, and I put them inside of tin cans so that larger animals can't get to them.
Oh, that's brilliant.
Yeah. So put them in a tin can, or better still, in like a piece of wide PVC pipe, or that black drain pipe.
Oh,
and
yes.
You put that black drain pipe along the run of the voles, because they make like little beaten paths on the surface of the ground. And you put the trap in there, then like a cat or, your dog or your kid or something is not going to get that. But the voles love to go in those little tunnels like that.
Right.
And then they'll get caught in the trap.
Oh,
yeah.
interesting.
So it's, people, if you're a super humane gardener, you might have a problem with that. So maybe you would want to use one of the deterrents that's based on castor oil. There's granular and liquid vole repellents and mole repellents that are based on castor oil. They work pretty well to deter them. So, if you're not into the whole idea of setting a mouse trap for them, I'd go for that method instead.
Perfect. Yeah. And you mentioned something that is curious to me, decomposers.
Yeah.
And so in the desert here, we grow our brassicas, which is cabbage, cauliflower, broccolis. We grow them in the wintertime.
Okay.
And usually about April, May timeframe, I start getting questions from customers from our listeners that say, hey, aphids are all over my broccoli. What's the deal? And I tell them, for here in the low desert, you should have already harvested that broccoli, because now the broccoli's gone to seed and the aphids show up as decomposers, right?
Technically, no. I mean, they're herbivores. So they're feeding on a plant in a live state, right? They're sucking the sap out of the plant.
Oh, very good. Okay.
So that plant is still in a living state. You won't find an aphid on already dead plant. You will only find it on a live plant.
See, I'm learning something new.
So a decomposer would be an insect that feeds on dead and decaying plant matter. So that would be, or prefers to feed on dead and decaying plant matter. So a lot of the beetles will do that, especially beetle larvae. They live on the ground and they eat that decomposing plant matter. Technically, sow bugs and pill bugs, which people also call like the roly-polies and stuff, those are technically decomposers. Occasionally they eat live plant material, but most often they feed on dead and decaying plant matter. So those would be our decomposers.
So those decomposers are, well, thanks for setting me straight on that, but the aphids show up toward the end of the life cycle of the broccoli here in Phoenix, and it helps start the decomposing process, I would guess.
Yeah, well, maybe. And they may be showing up at that time simply because of the species of aphid that they are and their life cycle. And that in conjunction with your weather patterns. Certainly here in Pennsylvania, we have aphids season long on our brassicas. So all season long. So it's probably more due to the species of aphid and the weather patterns and the climate than it is the fact that they're, in any way breaking down or decomposing.
Got it. All right, cool.
Yeah.
So let's talk about beneficial bugs, because you said earlier that 1% of the bugs are not beneficial. Well, you said that they're damaging and 99% aren't damaging. Of that 99%, how many are beneficial bugs?
Well, I mean, technically they're all beneficial, right? Because they all evolved to play a role in our gardens. So they all have a duty to perform out there. Now, whether or not that duty is something we humans like, that's a different story, right?
Exactly.
So they're all beneficial for the role that they're supposed to play in the ecosystem. When we talk about them being beneficial to us, we're typically talking about one of two groups of insects. And the first would be the pollinators. That would be, bees, butterflies, wasps, beetles, any insect that acts to move pollen from one flower to another, right? So the pollinators. And then we also have the group of beneficials that are either predators or parasites, or parasitoidal is technically what the term is. So these are the good bugs that help us control the bad bugs. So these are the ones that either feed on or lay their eggs in insects that we consider to be pests in our garden. So this might be a ladybug eating an aphid. It might be a lacewing eating a mealybug. It might be a parasitic wasp laying its egg in the back of that big old tobacco hornworm that you have on your tomato plants, right? So that group of beneficial insects is really huge, really diverse, and absolutely fascinating. And so there's thousands of species of them, and they have a really cool role to play in our garden.
Cool. So got a question here from Huey. Mushrooms are popping up in my garden bed. I mentioned them earlier. Is this a good thing?
I suppose it depends. I would say it's a benign thing. It could be a good thing if it's an edible mushroom. It could be a really bad thing if it's a poisonous mushroom and your kid takes a sample of it, right? But for the most part, it's a benign thing. I mean, their role for the most part is as a decomposer. Their fungal hyphae, or their quote unquote roots, which is the structure of them below ground that helps to break down organic matter within the soil and helps to decompose. Obviously some species of fungus are extremely beneficial because they form symbiotic relationships with the roots of our plants, and they allow those plants to access nutrients or to exchange nutrients with other plants. I mean, you guys might have seen on Facebook, there's been a little meme and a little video going around about how trees talk to one another. Oh, right. And they can do that through their fungal network and the fungal associations underground, the mycorrhizal fungi that form these networks underground. It's basically this giant communication system and transport system that's underground. So they can be extremely beneficial to our plants. In my own garden, I never worry when I see mushrooms, whether they're in my garden beds, in my lawn, on my trees, in the compost pile, wherever. I think they're absolutely fascinating. I don't eat them or anything like that, never, just because I wouldn't be confident in my own identification skills. Yeah. But I certainly appreciate them for the valuable role that they play.
Yeah, exactly. And so what I just heard you say is they're decomposers.
They are, not in every case. Not in every case. There are species, usually the ones where we call the fruiting body, which is the actual mushroom itself, springing up out of the ground. Many of those are decomposers, but that's only the small part that you see is only a tiny bit of that mushroom. The rest of the mushroom is this thread-like network under the ground of their hyphae under the ground. So those ones are definitely, most of those are decomposers. But then again, like I said, there's the mycorrhizal fungi, which are not decomposers. Instead, they're sort of this network of transportation in association with the tree roots. So they do have other roles to play as well.
Got it. Cool. So Jackie wants to know, chopping and dropping greenery and leaves into my garden beds. I worry about it robbing nitrogen from the plants. Is this still a good idea?
So that's a really good and a very interesting question, right? So usually when you chop and drop and you let it on the soil surface like that, if you are doing green plants, so plants that were like your broccoli plant when you cut it down, or your lettuce plants or your tomato plant, you cut it down, it's actually pretty rich in nitrogen. And so as it breaks down, it will return that nitrogen to the soil. But when you are putting brown material like wood chips or straw on the soil surface, that's a very carbon-rich ingredient. And during that decomposition process, it can take a little bit of nitrogen out of the soil to balance out that rich carbon. And you might, in the very, very top layer of soil, have a little bit of nitrogen depletion with that, but it's very minimal. And if you're only leaving it on the surface of the ground, it's really nothing that you have to worry about. Right. It's more critical if you're turning those wood chips into the soil where the zone where they're found in is much deeper. Then you have a bigger issue with more extensive, nitrogen, quote unquote, robbing from the soil. Yeah. But if you're just chopping and dropping, leaving it on the soil surface, and it's mostly green matter, you don't have to worry about that.
Excellent. Laura wants to know, she really wants to entice pollinators and butterflies to her garden for viewing pleasure and garden benefit. She says, I'm zone 4, 5, almost 5,000, 8,000 feet above sea level with massive tall pines. What recommendations do you have for anybody that wants to attract pollinators?
Yeah, so it's important, obviously, to try to go with native plants to your region, if at all possible, because they co-evolved with those species of pollinators that are native to your region. And so you want to make sure that you're providing them with the right kind of nectar And obviously, we want to use native plants whenever possible, just because it's good for many other reasons as well. So
Right.
that's not to say that non-native plants don't provide nectar for pollinators, because they certainly do. What I think a lot of scientists are looking at now is the fitness of that nectar. And is the nectar from a native plant more fit for our native pollinators, right? And so I think the jury is still out on whether or not that's the case. But my thing is, you certainly won't, it would never hurt to go with a native plant. So if you're putting in a new garden and you're making choices, why wouldn't you choose native plants, right? Because there's so many gorgeous and amazing ones.
Yeah.
I'm not a native purist, so I have lots of plants in my garden. I would say the bulk of them are native, but I grow peonies, I grow German bearded iris. I have plants that I love that I couldn't imagine gardening without, just because they're not native. But at the same point, if somebody who wants to use all native and opt for that, that's fantastic. And I love that, so it's really about what's right for you. But for pollinators, I would opt to choose as many native plants as possible. Find ones that are suitable for your climate as well. It is a challenge, more of a challenge in the shade, obviously, than it is in full sun. But thankfully, there's a lot of resources. And one of my favorite ones is, there's two different ones. One is the Xerces Society, Xerces, Xerces, which is the Society for Invertebrate Conservation. So it's bugs, right? It's all about, it's a great nonprofit association. They have native plant lists for every region of North America on their website.
Wow.
So you can go to Xerces, I think it's just xerces.org, Xerces.org, and look for their native plant lists there. And you'll find ones, they have them separated by like dry shade, sun, full sun, partial sun, blah, blah, blah. And then by, mid-Atlantic, Pacific coast, whatever. So you can look by the region. That's one. Also, the National Wildlife Federation, they have a native plant finder on their website as well, where you can go in. And I believe that one, you even enter your zip code and it spits out lists of native plants for your climate. So tons of resources out there that can help you find the best choices for where you live.
I know Brad Lancaster, he's a water harvesting guy down in Tucson, written books on water harvesting and natives. And they have found by using desert natives, it brings in more of the native pollinators, the native bugs, the native birds. So yeah, I'm all the way with you on natives.
And it's a diversity thing too. You never want to have all of any one plant. So you don't want just like an overwhelming amount of coneflower or an overwhelming amount of perennial sunflower. You want to have as many species, different flower forms, different shapes, different bloom times, different what we call floral architecture, which is the shape of the flower itself. Is it a daisy shape? Is it a spike shape? Is it an umbel, which is like an umbrella shape?
Right.
Because all of those different flower structures support and provide nectar for different kinds of insects, because they all have a different mouth, right? The morphology of the butterfly is different than the mouth morphology of a bee, of a tiny bee or a bumblebee, right? So the diversity of flowers leads to a diversity of pollinators.
Amen to that. So let's talk about bees for a minute, because mostly we think that there are one or two or three different kinds of bees. There's the big black bumblebee, there's honeybees, and what other kind of bees are there? So why should we encourage native bees, and how do we do that? Because there's hundreds or maybe even thousands of different kinds of native bees, right?
Yep, there's about 4,000 species of native bees in North America. So huge diversity. Only 4,000, right? Only 4,000. And our biggest one would be, if you know what a carpenter bee looks like, that's one of our biggest native bees. And they're nice. They're big, fat, sassy bees, and they're really cool. All the way down to the teeniest, tiniest little sweat bees. And there's actually a little carpenter bee that's very, very tiny. I mean, some of them are not much bigger than a gnat, right? And so, we have this crazy diversity of bees. Very few of them are yellow and black striped, sort of, the cartoon bee shape. They come in all kinds of different colors and shapes and patterns. And it's really amazing when you take a dive into the native bees and learn. If you can't learn about 4,000 different species, then maybe learn a couple different families. How can you recognize a bumblebee? How can you recognize our native sweat bees? How can you recognize our mining bees or our leafcutter bees, and get to know them? Because they're very, very charismatic insects. Most of them do not sting. They're very docile. Most of them are solitary. So they don't live in a big old hive like a European honeybee does, where there's thousands of them. Instead, they live, in a single solitary brood chamber, the female all by herself in a hole in the ground or a little tiny hole in a log. I think 70% of our native bees are ground nesting, where it's a solitary nester, one single insect in a little brood chamber. And then like the bumblebees are usually like 30 to 60 individuals in a colony. And it's like this little blob. And the way the queen bumblebee starts building that blob of a nest in an old rodent burrow or in a little hole in the ground. And she makes these little balls, and all of the balls stick together into this clump. It's really cool. You should Google it. Google a bumblebee nest and you'll come across this. They're so cool looking. And each one of those little balls, she lays an egg. She puts a wad of pollen and lays an egg in there. And that's where the larval bees. And then as that starts in the spring and it grows larger and the colony grows larger, and then at the very end of the season, the new queens are formed. So the only ones that overwinter are the fertilized queens. Then in the spring, they emerge. They go on to start again. So if you've got blueberries growing here in the east, at any rate, where we get freezing winter temperatures, the blueberries are one of their favorite foods in the spring. And if you see bumblebees on your blueberry plants pollinating, there's like a 99% chance that that's a female fertilized queen bumblebee, because they bloom so early in the season. And she's just getting started building her little nest.
Wow. Awesome. Here's a bee question from Jewel. How do I discourage the big black carpenter bee from tunneling through my 40-year-old mulberry tree?
Oh, don't. I thought you were going to say your fence. So I was going to offer you a way to deter them from your fence or your house with cedar siding. So that's worth discouraging them, right? Because it's your home. Right. It's an investment. And the problem is not necessarily the carpenter bees, but it's the woodpeckers that go after the carpenter bee larva, and they peck up your siding on your house, and they really can destroy it. But in your 40-year-old mulberry tree, that's where they belong. And that's where they should be setting up shop, those carpenter bees. And really, the carpenter bee will chew a hole and make a little tunnel, and then she lays her eggs in a brood chamber inside of that tunnel. And so that's exactly the environment where she's supposed to be setting up shop.
Well, and they don't eat live wood, do they?
Correct. No, they don't. They tunnel. They'll find a soft spot. So chances are that there was probably already some kind of rot inside of that mulberry tree. That's why she chose it as a good place to, easily chew through and get her eggs laid in there. Yep.
So to a certain extent, the bumblebee could be a decomposer because they're starting to break down dead wood.
The carpenter bee, technically a pollinator, but I suppose in a way that could be considered. You're really rooting for the decomposer.
I am, absolutely.
Well, how about slugs? They're a classic decomposer, those slugs. Everybody loves slugs, right?
Right. Well, people love them or love to hate them, one of the two.
They love to hate them, right? But when I said love, I meant love, not real love, of course. Right.
Exactly. So 433923M wants to know, if you add weeds and grass clippings to compost, will it result in weeds in your garden?
If the weeds have gone to seed, absolutely it will. So you want to make sure that you keep all weeds that have gone to seed out of the compost pile. And also, if it is a weed that has, little underground roots that easily take root, so something like Canada thistle or bindweed, where those little root pieces will form a whole new plant, keep those out of the compost pile as well. So compost really needs to heat up to about 135 degrees for a sustained period of about 2 weeks in order for it to be able to kill most weed seeds and little pieces of root like that. Very few home compost piles are turned. Yeah. I mean, you have to turn them regularly. You really have to monitor the balance of your nitrogen and carbon-based ingredients to really make sure that the pile gets up to that high of a temperature. A little different with a commercial pile where it's much bigger, right? And they're turning it on a regular basis. Yeah. Then that stuff is killed, but home compost piles, not so much.
Yeah, I give a class called non-composting because thermophilic or hot composting is really quite hard to do. And if all you have is kitchen scraps, get yourself a worm bin. Worms will eat all your kitchen scraps and make amazing worm poop. We call it worm castings. And that's great for your soil.
Yeah, it is. And actually, if people want to learn more about proper composting, where you're really paying attention to the carbon and nitrogen balance and why that's so important, we actually have an article up on Savvy Gardening. If you go to savvygardening.com and there's a little search box on the top and you type in compost how-to guide, you'll come up with the article. It's like a science-based guide to composting that explains all of that process and explains what you have to do in order to really get good quality, proper compost to come out of the bin.
Nice.
Yeah.
I'm going there.
There you go.
Because I'd like to read that. 433-923M wants to know, how do you use worm castings?
How do you not use worm castings? They're good for everything. In the wintertime, you can use them to top a house plant, work them into the top little bit of compost, worm castings on top of your potting soil. I love them to help fill my containers out in the garden. So when I'm filling up with my potting soil and blend in my containers, I'll add a couple of shovels full there. If you're planting your tomatoes, you can add a few shovels full into the hole where you're planting that tomato. Yeah. So pretty much any time you're planting something, you can work a little bit of those worm castings into the soil.
Absolutely. There's microorganisms in the worm castings. There's probably worm eggs in the worm castings that can, that help your garden.
Yeah. And it's crazy too. There's like all kinds of cool amino acids and exudates that help soil bind together. So they change the way that the soil can aggregate, and they change the soil structure to really make it more friable and easy to work. And so that's all found in those worm castings. So when we work them into the soil, we're also seeing those benefits too.
Yeah. All right. You just used a word, and I'd like you to define it for us. Friable. That's what I do. That's what I do with French toast in the morning. How do you use the word?
Not F-R-Y-A-B-L-E, F-R-I-A-B-L-E. Friable, loose, crumbly, easy to work.
Very good.
So when you watch Martha Stewart and she goes out in her garden and she digs and it's all this crumbly, dark, rich soil, because someone's been adding a ton of organic matter in there over the years. It's real easy to work. That's friable soil.
Excellent. Well, thank you so much for joining us on the Garden Chat tonight, Jessica.
It's been fun. Thank you for letting me talk so passionately about bugs, too. A lot of people don't like to listen to that.
Oh, my gosh. You kidding? Bring it on. So you guys have a newsletter, the Savvy Gardening newsletter. How does somebody sign up for it?
Yeah, we do. So you can just go to savvygardening.com. We've got a box. We don't do pop-ups, but we have a box on the side of the main, and in fact, on every page on the website, and it's a little sign up for the Savvy Gardening newsletter. You just click on that. We don't use it for anything else other than our newsletter. We don't sell any. We don't spam anything. All you do is every 2 weeks, you get the newsletter.
Nice. All right. And Janice is giving me another message. Next month, we have our friend Emily Rocky. And she's going to be talking about pathways to healthy soil. That's May 25th at 5 p.m. Pacific. So join us for that. And once again, Jessica, thank you so much for everything you do and for showing up tonight. We really appreciate it.
Thank you so much. It was my pleasure.
We hope you enjoyed today's episode of the Urban Farm Podcast. Remember to listen for tips, advice, and resources to help you on your journey with urban farming. You can find us on the web at urbanfarm.org or send us an email to podcast@urbanfarm.org. In the words of Vincent van Gogh, great things are done by a series of small things brought together. Be encouraged that with each lesson learned and skill developed, you are one step closer in the direction of your dreams.